Yeah.
So he thinks
class about taking a music class. Yeah, it's tough to like be honest. What are you doing for your fieldwork project? I just started last night interviewing people in the goths and that's cool. Yeah, there's goth night now at the library. But yeah, the people who did that original things. Yeah, so I'm very cool. Well, we should begin. Welcome everybody. I'm Dr. Dow. I'm the director of the Steele Center for the Study of Philosophy of Religion. Some of you. And welcome to the Wednesday afternoon discussion. Today we have Dr. Paul Katsafanas, professor of philosophy at BU, Boston University. And Dr. Katsafanas studies Nietzsche and metaethics, ethical theory, and lots of other stuff, 19th century philosophy. And you're also you're going to publish a book on devotion. Yeah. Is that right? I noticed that's coming out in December with Oxford University Press. What's the title?
It's called Philosophy of Devotion, the Longing for Invulnerable Ideals. Yeah. And that's actually related to what I'll talk about today.
So let's give Dr. Katsafanas a warm welcome.
Well, thanks very much. I appreciate the invitation. I'm really happy to be here and have a chance to talk to all of you guys. So I thought I'd just talk for like 10, 15 minutes to sort of frame the questions and then we can launch into discussion and talk about whatever you guys want. But okay, so what I'm interested in putting forward for you guys, what you think about, is one of the ideas that I explore in this book that I just mentioned, the book on the philosophy of devotion. So let me put it this way. It seems to me like there are two things that we admire in people that are potentially in tension with one another. So I want to think about whether these two things can be present together or whether they sort of undermine one another. So one of the things is a kind of wholehearted commitment to an ideal or a cause or a value or a relationship. That's the sort of thing that I call devotion in this book that I mentioned. But what I mean by that is that we tend to admire people who are really steadfast in their pursuit of certain ends, who don't like waver in the face of adversity, who don't give up when there's a bit of difficulty, but sort of persevere and stick to the thing that they're committed to. So you can think of different examples of that. Like that could happen, it could happen in the athletic realm. So you might admire an athlete who really perseveres, even when they're facing difficulties, when going gets tough, when maybe they're injured and have to struggle against that. You can think of it in the political realm. You can think of somebody who's an activist for some cause, and despite opposition and struggle and so forth, they don't waver. They just remain steadfastly committed to whatever it is that they're going for. Or you can think of somebody who has some more philosophical type of ideal or value that they're committed to in that way. So think about maybe some of your favorite philosophers. So think about like Socrates, for example. A lot of you guys have probably encountered Socrates in various classes. There's somebody who seems just unwaveringly committed to understanding or wisdom or truth, and is going to endure quite a lot of opposition and difficulty and struggle and so forth, and ultimately even endure a trial and execution and so forth as a result of his commitment to those ideals, right? And he just won't back down and won't waver from them. So I think we often view that sort of thing as really admirable, that kind of thing that we might call devotion to ideals or wholehearted commitment to ideals, right? But of course, that can come in bad forms as well. So I've mentioned some good forms, but you can also imagine people who are committed in that way to really pernicious ideals or evil ideals, and who just don't back down from those sorts of ideals. So that brings me to the second thing that I think is potentially in tension with this first thing that I mentioned, devotion. The second thing is that we seem to admire people who are willing to be critical about their commitments, who are willing to reflect critically on them, to ask questions about whether they can really be justified, and to give them up or at least modify them or attenuate them if they don't look fully justifiable, right? So we would like it if when a person is committed to some cause or some ideal, if the person recognizes that that cause or ideal is questionable, that it doesn't have like a decisive justification, that there are alternative reasonable ideals that conflict with it, we typically like the person to moderate their commitment to that ideal, to adjust their commitment in light of that reflection. In the same way that we do with beliefs, for example. So, you know, if there's less than certain proof that something is true, you might think that people shouldn't believe it wholeheartedly and unreservedly, right? So, you know, if the weather report says that there's a 50% chance of rain tomorrow, and that's all the evidence that I have about the weather, but I am just totally certain that it's going to rain tomorrow, that looks a little weird, right? It looks like I should adjust my beliefs in light of the available evidence. So you might think that something like that should be true of practical commitments too, commitments to ideals and values and relationships, that, you know, if you're 100% certain, if you have a decisive justification that that some ideal is appropriate or some cause is the right one, then you should go for it wholeheartedly. But if you don't, maybe you should back off of that. You should be committed in a more moderate way. You should sort of attenuate your commitment to that ideal. Okay, so those are the two things that I want to think about. So the one thing is that it looks really admirable when people are steadfast and devoted to certain kinds of ideals and relationships and values. But on the other hand, it looks problematic when people don't adjust their commitments in light of critical reflection on their justifications, their, you know, the evidence for them, the warrant for them, things like this. So those two things, I want to think about whether they can go together. They obviously could go together in a certain way. So if it were possible to have decisive, unquestionable justifications for ideals or values or causes, then you can imagine that people should only be wholeheartedly committed to those things, right? So just as in the case of belief, you might think the only beliefs that we should have with complete certainty are the ones that are unquestionable, where you can like answer any skeptic, where you can knock down any counter arguments. So too, in the case of ideals or values or commitments, it might seem like the only ones that you should have wholeheartedly and unreservedly would be the ones where you can sort of knock down any argument against them, you can refute any contrary ideals, any alternative commitments, right? So that would be one way that you could go. The thing is, you might worry about whether it's ever actually possible to do that, right? So I think that you know, some philosophers hold out hope that one day we'll be able to offer sort of skeptic-proof justifications of particular ethical ideals or standards or commitments or sets of values. That is a possible view. It's not one that I personally think is very likely. I think there are a lot of potential problems with that line of thinking. And one of the problems is that I think a lot of people nowadays are attracted to what's sometimes called pluralism about ethical theories. So pluralism, there are different ways of defining it, right? But one way of thinking about it is this. A pluralist is somebody who thinks there's more than one set of values or more than one ethical theory that could be reasonable to accept, right? So the opposite of that would be to think, I guess, two opposites in a way. One way of being opposed to pluralism would just be to be a total relativist, where you think that like, any values that you accept, any ethical theory you accept is equally as good as any other, that there are no rational grounds for choosing between them, right? So just like anything goes. That would be one way to go. The opposite extreme is the position where you think there's a single correct ethical theory or a single correct set of values, right? So those are the two extreme positions. There's one theory that's right, where that absolutely everything goes, that there's nothing that you can privilege or say is best. Pluralism would be a sort of in-between position, where you think that you can rule out certain sets of values or ethical theories. You can rule in others. You can say that other sets are acceptable. You might even be able to do some comparisons and say that like some sets are better than other sets, but you won't get a uniquely best set. You won't get a uniquely best set of values or a uniquely best ethical theory, right? So that's a position that's sometimes called pluralism. And that's the kind of theory that I'm sort of attracted to, that I think is probably right. And one way of thinking about that is that if something like that is true, so if you're a pluralist about ethics or about values, it looks like it potentially creates a problem with those first two things that I mentioned, this idea that we'd like there to be these wholehearted commitments, but we'd also like them to be responsive to critical reflection. Because here's the thing, and it looks like even if a set of commitments is very well justifiable from within a certain set of values, it looks like there's probably an alternative reasonable set of values in terms of which those commitments are not acceptable or are not the best. So that's very abstract. So let me give you some examples of how that might go. You can think of it, here's one example. We could think about somebody who thinks that, so like I myself am not at all religious, right? But other people are religious. I don't necessarily think they're making a mistake by doing that. So I think there are reasonable grounds for accepting certain kinds of religious convictions. I myself don't go into that, but I can see why other people would. In light of certain religious commitments, some particular actions or some particular values or some political commitments will look problematic. Whereas if you're not in favor of those religious commitments, they won't. They'll look perfectly acceptable, right? That would be one sort of example. Another example might be, suppose that you think that, so suppose you yourself are, let's say you accept a certain kind of political theory, according to which, let's say, democracy is the best sort of political system. But let's say that you don't think there's like a decisive argument against other possible forms of political arrangements. You think that, some should be ruled out. So you shouldn't just have these like highly autocratic systems or things like that, right? You shouldn't have tyrannies. But maybe you think that there are other acceptable ways of organizing societies other than democracy. Some people hold views like that, right? I myself am committed to the democratic system where we elect officials and so forth. But when I really think about it, I guess I don't honestly believe that I have decisive arguments against those alternative positions. Like, I think there's stuff I can say. I think there are ways I can argue against the other systems. But I don't think I have like a totally knockdown argument against everything that people in favor of some other systems can say. So in that sense, I think that you could be reasonable and you could accept an alternative system. If that's right, again, it looks like there are going to be certain problems because how can I be sort of wholeheartedly committed to certain kinds of political commitments, certain kinds of political values, ideals, and causes, while recognizing that they're really only justifiable from within my own evaluative framework, my own political framework, right? And while thinking that there are other political frameworks that it would also be reasonable to accept. Does that make sense? Do you see that? So, and if that's too abstract, you don't even really have to worry about these like highly general cases. I think you even see the same thing just when you're thinking about particular actions. So let me just give you like a quick example of that. So just take any like ordinary action that you might perform, like your any long-term action, like you're deciding a career, or even you're just deciding whether to go on vacation or something like that, right? Let's just take the vacation example. So I might think, okay, it'll be summer in a few months. I'd like to go on a trip. I'd like to go on vacation. And there are different sorts of values or normative standards that I could use to try to like weigh what I should do. So I could think about what would make me happiest. So there, the value that I'm employing is my own happiness, and I might try to like rank various possibilities in terms of how happy they make me. I might think about the environmental toll that various kinds of trips would take. So like obviously a local trip is going to be less environmentally damaging than a very long trip. So I might think about it in that way. I might think about how the trip to various places would affect people in the communities I might visit or something like that. I might also just think more generally about whether whatever amount of money I could use on the trip could be put to better causes. So, can I really justify spending all this money on just a nice vacation when there are people who are starving and need help and so forth? So I could use ethical standards like that to think about it. And the thing is, like, even if I think all those things are valid ways of evaluating actions. So I think we should think about what's ethical, what's right and wrong. I think we should think about enjoyment. So I think my own happiness matters. I think the environment matters. I don't want to do things that are too destructive to the environment. So all of these are valid standards, but I might be unsure about how to prioritize them or like how much weight to give each of them, right? So is the environmental consideration more important than my own happiness, or should I flip it the other way around? Are the ethical standards to be prioritized over everything else? Or can I, at least in some circumstances, weight my own happiness above the fact that there are definitely better uses that I can make with that money, ethically speaking? So you can imagine that different people would come to different conclusions there. So one sort of person might think that, no, you really got to weight the ethical thing highest. You've got to overrule everything else, so that if the trip raises any ethical qualms whatsoever, you got to rule it out and just prioritize the amount of good that you can do, ethically speaking, with that money. Other people might think that no, you don't have to do that, but you should be highly attentive to the environmental costs of things like airline travel and stuff like that. And that might overrule the happiness I get from, I don't know, going to Italy or whatever. Other people might say, no, just, at least within a certain realm, you can just attend to your own happiness. You don't have to think so much about the ethical and environmental considerations, at least in this sort of case. And I mean, again, like I can see arguments in favor of each of those three positions that I've described. I have a view about, how I should deliberate in a case like that, how I should weight those things. But I don't think that I have the only reasonable view. Like, I don't think that people who rank those three considerations, the ethical, environmental, and happiness-based considerations, people who rank them in different ways are making a mistake. I think there are a lot of legitimate ways to rank them. But I've got to make a choice, right? So I've got to prioritize one of those sets of standards over others. Can I do that with conviction, like wholeheartedly, or remain committed to it? That's a question, right? Because as soon as I recognize that other people can be equally rational in making sort of the opposite decision from the one that I make, how do I preserve my commitment to whatever it is that I've decided? In this case, maybe it's a little easier because not much really hinges on it, but in cases where remaining committed to the thing involves some self-sacrifice, some difficulty, some foregoing of like alternative goods to be achieved, then it might look a little harder, right? How can I remain steadfast in my commitment to whatever I've chosen while recognizing that from other perspectives or from people who rank particular standards differently, you get a different conclusion. Okay, so that's the general problem that I'm interested in, right? It's this problem about how if you don't think that we're ever going to reach agreement on a single best way of either ranking particular evaluative standards or deciding on like a single best ethical theory or a single set of values, how, if at all, is it still possible to have the form of wholehearted, devoted commitment to ideals or actions or causes, things like that, I was mentioning earlier? Do you end up undermining that form of wholehearted devotion causes? So that's the puzzle. I can say some stuff about what I think is true in response to that. So I've been thinking a lot about this sort of issue, and I have this book coming out where I try to think about roughly this question and develop some responses to it. But I'd be really interested just in hearing what you guys think about, like whether you think it's a good question, whether you feel the force of that question, whether you think there's a solution to it, things of that sort. So I don't know, does anybody want to, or just if it's not clear, any questions, I can try to clarify things.
I was gonna ask, can you state your question again?
Yeah, so my question is this. So I think we have these two things that we admire. We admire when people are steadfastly, resolutely, wholeheartedly committed to either an action or a value or a cause or a political commitment. So we admire that form of wholeheartedness. But we also want commitments to be responsive to considerations of whether they're reasonable or whether they're justified, or whether you have a good argument for prioritizing them over other possible commitments. So those are the two things we want. And then the thing that makes me question whether you have both of those things is this point about pluralism, this idea that there's not a single best way of ranking sets of values or ethical views or things like that. Does that make sense? Yeah.
It seems to me that, at least on the ethical, it's an ethical question. Pluralism is really an appreciation really of situation, epistemology, situation ethics, right?
Yeah, you can think of it that way. So like, I guess there are different ways of taking it. Because one way you could take it is that, so some pluralists think that there might actually be a single correct theory or something like that, a single correct set of truths, but we'll just never grasp it, perhaps because of the way that we're epistemically situated. So there'll just be irresolvable disagreement forever. There'll be some progress, but you'll never get to a single. So that's one, and then the other one would be that there's something about like the way in which we're situated in cultures or our background values, or something about the structure of our societies or our developments or our characters or something like that, that just makes it the case that there isn't even a single, so it's not just an epistemic problem of the second reading, but there really just isn't a single best way of living. There are lots of better and worse ways, but there might be a bunch of equally good ways, so that there's not a single best one. So in that sense too, it would be about how we're situated with respect to these values.
Talk a little bit about like disagreements and reasonable disagreements. Do you think there are like reasonable disagreements and then like unreasonable ones?
Oh yeah, definitely.
And how does that work, right? Like, how do you know in the pluralistic compare and contrast that this is a reasonable disagreement between us?
That's a good question.
And versus in another context, I think someone's just you can't find common ground, or what's the way that you determine that you've got an unreasonable disagreement?
Yeah. So I think there are a couple of things. So I guess the easiest thing is if the position you're arguing against, the one that you think is unreasonable, if it's just sort of inconsistent or unreasonable, even on its own terms. So it has some contradictions within the set of assumptions the person from the alternative perspective is operating with. That's the easiest way, because then you can just say, look, you accept this claim and this claim, but they contradict one another. So my position, which doesn't have that contradiction, is better than yours. But of course, that's only a redundant set of cases. So the other thing, which I think you're mentioning, is this point about overlapping consensus on certain points. So I think that a lot of the positions that we'll think of as reasonable, they share some commitments. They don't share all the commitments. But if there's some common ground, then that can give you a sort of inroads into critiquing elements of the alternative position and showing it to be unreasonable. So you might have somebody who accepts the idea. Well, I don't know. I mean, like historically speaking, we can think of lots of views like this. So you could think of views where, for example, people will accept certain ideas about human equality or human dignity, but then they somehow won't recognize that their ethical theory is actually committed to treating either like races or groups or cultures unequally. So many I mean, this could also turn just internal critique, but it could also be this sort of overlapping consensus point where you say, okay, we both accept this principle. This principle is incompatible with this other stuff that you believe. So you got to get rid of that other stuff so as to preserve this principle here. So I think in ways like that, you can get these critiques and these positions you can show to be unreasonable. But I guess I think that even after you do all that, you'll sometimes, I think you'll still be left with a lot of reasonable positions where you might not have those sorts of opinions. You might not show your own position to be superior to that. I don't know that.
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of thinking about like the case of someone who starts off being kind of devoted, religiously, and then they like take a Christian class or something, and find out about really all these different religions. On your view, is it the case that would you predict that person that would become less committed,
Right.
and then I was just sort of wondering, like, well, what drives that commitment? Sometimes a person's faith is not based in, faith can be preserved by way of something else other than the conversations with others, or discovery of how to follow.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting case. So in a case like that, so you're a member of one religion, and then you can assume you never even like think about other religions until you take this class, but then you're exposed to a bunch of others, and they look reasonable to you. I mean, you see that the people, I mean, you might even come to the view that they're just as reasonable as your own religion, right? That you really have no reason other than your own contingent history and how you're brought up and so forth for adopting your own religion as opposed to one of these other religions. So I think that's an experience that some people have. Like I had an experience like that. I wasn't deeply religious as a child or anything, but my parents were Catholic, and I was just sort of like the default view. Later on in high school and college, I saw other stuff and had this sort of experience. But so I think a couple of things can happen there. So I think one thing that could happen is you could think that the fact that there are these other equally reasonable religions somehow destabilizes your own religious commitments. And I think for some people that does happen. So sometimes just the recognition that there's this contingency in your commitments, plus the thought that there's no way of justifying your own preference to these other ones, that can just create a kind of crisis of faith for some people, right? But obviously that doesn't happen for everyone. There are ways around it. So one way around it that I think is really interesting, and I think this happens not just in the religious domain, but with a lot of other values and commitments that have a similar structure, is that people sometimes reinterpret what exactly it is that they're committed to. So you might start out, for example, with the idea that what you're committed to is something that can be very precisely articulated, where you can just sort of state in like a series of sentences that, I believe this, I believe that, and have a fairly clear specification of what all of that is. But I think that one thing that's interesting is that in a lot of cases of our deepest, most fundamental commitments, they sort of resist that kind of clarification or that kind of articulacy, where we have a lot of trouble even really stating what they are in a precise, informative way. And I think that's really interesting. I think one thing that points to is that, so this doesn't have to be done in full consciousness, but I think that like one thing that sometimes happens is that when a commitment is very precisely stated, it's easier to refute, right? Or it's easier to call into question. When a commitment is more amorphous, where it like resists articulation, it's harder to, because when somebody raises an objection to it, you can take that objection to be targeting an incorrect description of the commitment, rather than the correct description. Whereas so let me put that a little more clearly. So if I just I mean, a lot of us have done philosophy, right? So you can think of this in terms of a philosophy paper. Like if imagine you're writing an argument against somebody else's philosophy paper. If the person you're critiquing is super clear and just has, like, maybe there's just a single premise that is very precisely stated, then you can just like target that premise and you can give a critique of it. And if you knock down that premise, if you have an argument against it, the whole thing collapses, right? Then contrast that with a philosopher who writes in a more opaque way, where they're arguing for something, and maybe the argument's even really like insightful and interesting and seeming. But there's going to be lots of ways that you could potentially characterize what the philosopher is saying. And I think a lot of the great philosophers are like this. So Nietzsche, who I read about, is definitely like this. I think Kant and Aristotle and some other figures are like this, where it's like really hard to pinpoint that even though they're like undeniably brilliant and have revolutionary ways of thinking about things, it's really hard to pinpoint in an uncontroversial way exactly what they're saying. So when you try to engage with one of those philosophers, it would be much harder to refute them, right? Because whenever suppose I interpret Kant in a certain way, and I like write down Kant says X, and then I have this objection that X is false, right? Somebody who is committed to Kant's view can then just say, no, Kant didn't really believe X, he really believed this other thing, right? And that can preserve the philosophical theory in this case from refutation, right? You can remain committed to it because you take the objection to be based on a misunderstanding of what the philosopher is really getting at. So I think something similar, sorry, this is like a long-winded response, but I think something similar happens with things like religious commitments and just other commitments generally that are really important to us, like personal commitments, political commitments, things like this. I think that often when we feel that they're being called into question, there's this move to try to preserve them by making them a little bit more opaque, a little less articulate. And I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing. I think there are a lot of benefits to doing this. But what it does is it sort of insulates the commitment from critique in a certain way, because you see maybe the critique can knock down this one particular interpretation of what the commitment is, but it can't knock down the commitment itself. It just gets the bad interpretation of it. So I think that's like a really familiar thing in philosophy. I think that happens all the time, especially if you're working on the history of philosophy, where you're interpreting these like brilliant figures. But I think it happens with our own personal commitments quite a lot. And I think there are a lot of benefits to it. Like, I don't know, if you think about the history of philosophy point, for example, it would be really bad. It would be a shame if like somebody had written a quick refutation of Kant and everybody just like took that to be true and we just don't read them anymore, right? There's a lot that you gain from continuing to engage with these fascinating ideas in that way, in the way that like insulates them from complete refutation. But I think you can do the same thing in maybe a less overt way with things like religious commitments and personal commitments. So that's one of the things I try to explore in this book I mentioned as a solution to how you might preserve this wholehearted form of commitment together with a kind of critique. It's basically that you take the critique to be targeting your present understanding or your present capacity to articulate the commitment rather than the commitment in its deeper form or its truer form. And I think that happens all the time with religions, for example. So yeah, that's how it traces back to your question.
Studying philosophy, psychology, and religion, talk about the attributional blank check.
Yeah.
That you had so it's kind of like you've got it's almost like self-handicapping because you've always got an out for changing your position a little.
Right. So, and I think some people are, some philosophers seem deliberate about that. So Nietzsche, who I read about that, he seems deliberate about that, right? So he, if you've read Nietzsche, I guess a lot of you have, right? He's very resistant to precise formulations of claims. And he's also very attentive to what he's doing rhetorically. Like, so Nietzsche's one of those philosophers who doesn't just like write stuff down. He thinks about the form in which he's conveying his philosophy, right? he spends a lot of time trying out different styles and different literary techniques and stuff like that. And I think it's this sort of point. It's I mean, one other thing, aside from preserving your own commitments in that way, one other thing that it does is it might lead you to sort of continuously dwell. So if I want to be a really influential philosopher, there might be some advantages to writing in an enticing but somewhat opaque way rather than an exceptionally clear way. Just because the exceptionally clear way looks more easily refutable and doesn't preserve this sort of air of having something deeper. And I guess air of something deeper, maybe that's the wrong word or the wrong phrase, because it suggests that, it's all just an illusion or something. I don't think I think sometimes it really is pointing you towards something deeper and helping you to grasp some underlying insight. If that makes sense.
So something that I've just like been thinking about as we've been talking about pluralism and devotion is like as I'm like thinking back on a lot of the philosophers that like I've gone through like early modern, late modern, and then with some of the other upper level courses that I've taken, it seems to me that this idea of pluralism is like, I wouldn't say like growing or expanding, but it's becoming more of a theme that I can see within like philosophers over time. So like Aristotle, I would say it's not super pluralistic compared to Nietzsche, which is like, so with that, would you say there's like a different level of like devotion to their ideas with that? So like the less pluralistic, would they be like more devoted?
They could be, and maybe not. I guess I wouldn't say they necessarily are, but I think it's easier to be, because so like one thing that can threaten devotion is the idea that you don't have a good justification for your commitments, that other people could have equally reasonable ones. So if you're somebody who thinks there's like a single correct ethical theory or a single correct set of values, and that you have that single correct set of values, then it's still going to be hard to be devoted, because it's just difficult sometimes to face all the obstacles and challenges. So you'll still have that, but you won't have this sort of philosophical problem of justifying those values and preference to others. So yeah, I think it's a more difficult problem if you're a pluralist than if you have a more unitary ethics or values generally.
Even if the loyalties are not ultimately divided, there are multiple focuses.
Yeah, so you can always be tempted toward other ones. And yeah, that's another thing is that another interesting question is whether, so I guess most of my examples are people who are sort of committed to one set of values or one ideal, but then they're considering like other reasonable ones. But another thing could just be that your loyalties could be sort of split, so that I might be devoted both to philosophy and to my family and to other stuff, and these might cut against each other in certain cases. I might have to sacrifice one to promote the other, and that too could be part of the struggle, right? I mean, it
seems true to life.
Yeah, and a worry about that is that if you do have this more pluralistic view that I was describing, it makes it even harder, right? Because, okay, so it's one thing, for example, if I think that I have this decisive justification that shows that philosophy should be prioritized over everything else, right? So if I think that truth or wisdom or understanding, that's the most important, most valuable thing, everything else should be subordinated to it. Then if preserving that commitment requires great sacrifice, if it requires me to give up other things that I value, if I've got the justification, that at least helps, right? I can at least tell myself, okay, it's not going to be easy, but it at least helps to think that this thing is genuinely more valuable than these other things. So I'm thinking about, if I have the pluralist view, though, then I can't quite do that, right? I mean, I've got to think that, sure, one reasonable position is to prioritize philosophy's value over the value of these other things. But another reasonable position might be to do the opposite, to think that you prioritize, I don't know, family or happiness or something else over intellectual virtues. And then if I really start to worry about that, and I'm faced with cases in which I have to undergo great sacrifices to remain committed to truth or understanding or wisdom, it's going to be hard, right? You might think that it's going to be much harder than the case, right? I think I enjoy that decisive justification. So yeah, so that's a sort of worry that you could find your commitments being eroded or moderated by those sorts of reflections.
Thanks, Brian. So I was gonna ask, in cases where it's kind of a Frankfurt case where you do something and it can kind of fall into two moral frameworks. So the thing can fall into two moral frameworks, and which framework does it lend itself? Does it lend itself towards?
So you're thinking of a case where I do something and there are two different frameworks that I can evaluate it in terms of.
Oh, look,
Is that the idea?
you do something and what you did can fit into like two different frameworks, kind of give the go ahead for that action.
Okay. Right.
How would you know which one is really supported?
Yeah. Okay. So this is the case where, like, I don't know, just to give an example, let's say there are two philosophical theories. There's, like, let's say utilitarianism, there's one ethical theory, and there's, I don't know, Kantian ethics, there's another. And they both say to do the same thing in this circumstance.
Yes.
And I'm sort of like undecided about which of those theories is right.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess in a case like that, it's lucky that they give you the same verdict, right? That they give you the same result, because then it sort of doesn't matter which one I pick if they're both pointing me in the same direction. So if I think one of those is right, but I'm not sure which, one of those theories is right, I'm not sure which, but they both say to do the same thing, that's lucky. But then the worry is that it's only accidental that they line up that way in this case. That's sort of getting back to the Frankfurt stuff. So in another case, they might point in totally opposite directions. They might, the one theory might say, do this, the other might say, don't do this. So then when they start to diverge, that's when I'm going to get into trouble, and I'm going to have to pick one or the other, at least in that situation, or find some other way of dealing with the situation. Yeah. Does that help? Is that the?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a good question.
One thing that's psychologically true is that once you make that decision, whether they're in agreement or whether you make a bifurcated decision, you are much more committed to that decision.
That's true. Yeah. So sometimes I think that does happen. That we, yeah. I mean, one thing I was interested in when I was thinking about these issues is there's a lot of empirical psychology on these sorts of questions, and a lot of work on decision making and how we make these sorts of trade-offs, and how that speaks to our commitments, what sorts of reflections are an issue. It's really interesting, and I think one of these points is that there are certain kinds of cases, especially these ones that if you've taken psychology, especially social psychology classes, you might have encountered talk of what are sometimes called sacred values, where there are these values that operate differently than ordinary values. They're not compromised. They have other features as well. But anyway, one thing that psychologists have noticed about those cases in these studies is that with this special set of values, with sacred values, you'll sometimes get into these situations where you've got two sacred values and they tell you to do opposite things, or one says do this, the other says don't do this. So you're in this tragic situation where no matter what you do, you'll violate one of those sacred values. And one thing that happens in those cases, at least in these studies, is that whatever they choose people feel better about that choice, the longer it takes them to make that choice. The more and more they like agonize over it and deliberate about it. So that's one thing. But the other thing is that they seem to become more invested in the thing that they've chosen, right? So if they choose action A instead of action B, then they become more invested in whatever value supports action A, and just less invested in B. So yes, I think that's something that's really interesting psychologically. That there seems to be this.
Once we decide, once we pick the values, once they are, or once we enact the values, especially, that has, I think, special power.
Yeah, they stick around. Yeah.
So would you say that pluralism is advocating for like no universal maxims and that pick and choose our ethical theories based on whatever benefits us at the time? Or is it more of that there's like this broader set of rules dictating what rules to do?
Yeah, it's more that second thing. I mean, I guess you could have a version of it, I guess, that said the first thing. Just to clarify, so one view would be that, in any given situation, you just pick whichever theory best suits you, or so maybe and actually, sometimes you see reasoning like this about difficult cases, like in medical ethics and so forth. You might think that, okay, in this one case where we're deciding this difficult medical ethics issue, it looks like Kantian ethics gives us the insight. In this other case, utilitarianism gives us the insight, even though those two things are incompatible with one another, right? So that's something that some people do. But I was thinking a bit more in terms of the second possibility that you mentioned, where it's not so much that we should switch, that like individual people should switch at different moments in their lives between different theories, but just that, I might for my whole life remain committed to a particular kind of moral perspective while recognizing that other people would be equally justified in having some moral perspective that conflicts to some extent with my own. So it's more of that sort of thing, the worry about this alternative perspective. Because I think the first thing can be critiqued in a lot of ways. I mean, it can look sort of self-serving in a way if I just, it doesn't have to be, but it could be a bit self-serving if I just sort of like pick whichever theory conforms to my intuitions about this case and then switch to a different one in different circumstances, stuff like that.
Importantly, he said that what is self-serving.
Yeah.
What gets me what I want.
Yeah, exactly. So I think there'd be some difficulties, but yeah, so I had mine more the second thing. It's a good distinction.
Yeah, I'm still working all the way through this. Thinking through. If we start with the assumption that, at least in some cases, from a given body of evidence, two rational people could understand that evidence and go down different paths to conclusions that are, to some degree, mutually exclusive. So there's the one question of then, taking the higher in that situation. There's the one question of how you and I then get along. We essentially agree to disagree, we respect each other. There's the question, I was going to change James's example a little bit. There's also the question, though, and this seems to be what you're after, is once I realized that I've got these really strong commitments, but that had things been different, I would have come to very different deep commitments. So I'm raised Catholic. My Catholic faith is very important to me. And at some point in my life, it occurs to me, I bet if my parents had been devout Muslims instead of devout Catholic, I'd now be. I'm the sort of person who would be a devout Muslim. Once I realized that, what should that do to my values?
Exactly.
That I, in the real world, do.
Yeah.
And it seems either everything goes out the window at that point. I become a total skeptic about everything because I realize that's not just true about my religious beliefs, it's my political beliefs.
Yeah.
Everything would be different had these contingencies early upbringing. That's what. Or say I got to choose somehow.
Yeah.
And just being brought up that way is one thing to push me toward this. I was thinking Descartes had a lot of his Protestant friends were trying to convert him to his Dutch friends trying to convert him to Protestantism, and he would say, "The religion of my kingdom is good enough for me."
Right.
I was brought up Catholic basically, so
Yeah.
I got to take something. So as long as there's always going to be something outside of my control in the end.
Yeah.
So I've got to use something as my motivation to pick A over B. And maybe the contingencies of my upbringing as good as anything.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's great. That's a really clear way of putting it. And what I'm after is definitely the thing that you ended with, the second position, where it's not so much about interpersonal or is your personal, it's not about you and me getting along, it's about how I relate to my own fitness. And I think you're right that one way of looking at it is you have these two possibilities that you either just give up everything because any commitment could be undermined this way, or you just sort of accept it and try to live with it. But I guess I think that second possibility, although it's what I want, is more complicated than it might initially appear. Because I think it's perfectly possible to do that in a certain way, to say that, well, let's take the Muslim Catholic case. It's one thing to say that, I was brought up in this way and therefore I'm Catholic. If I was brought up another way, I'd be a Muslim. That's just the way it is. I'll just stick with being Catholic. But then think about when that starts imposing costs, either on you or people you care about or on your political community or whatever. I mean, there are cases in which those values, if they're really deep commitments that you abide by wholeheartedly, are going to raise political costs. They're going to require you to either sacrifice things that you hold dear or be willing to live with other people or impose sacrifices on them. Or is it going to create some psychological difficulty for you because it's the other people violating things you think shouldn't be violated, stuff like this. In the face of that, I think there's a temptation to sort of back off of them a bit. So to still have, still say that you're a Catholic or that you're a Muslim, but not to have that really be the strong, firm, resolute kind of commitment that you might have initially had it be. So I guess I think it's totally possible to have what you were describing as a second reaction where you say, yeah, this is true of everything, and therefore we just got to live with it. We've got to just live with this. But what I worry about, sorry, let me back on it. So I think that's possible, and I think that you can have commitments with that view. What I worry about is whether you can have the sort of full-fledged, resolute, wholehearted commitments that, not in every case, but in some cases, are really admirable. I worry that those resolute commitments start being undermined in terms just of like ordinary, more fungible commitments, ones that can be traded against one another and compromised without much consequence and things like that. So it's really just the really strong, wholehearted, resolute form of commitment that I wonder about in that epistemic situation that you're describing. So I don't know if you buy that, but yeah,
It's definitely complicated, right?
Yeah. Yes.
And I'm trying to think about how
Yeah.
but I guess I wondered too, in terms of that commitment, and just thinking about this conversation in terms of where you're kind of everyday practice. It's like thinking specifically about or because it's practice centered. So the commitment is
Sure. Yeah.
And so kind of thinking about how that is this conversation.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. So I mean, I guess I think it's complicated, but I think certain kinds of wholehearted commitments are easier to sustain with this kind of reflection in the background than others are. So so earlier I was talking about how if the commitments are focused on something that's kind of inarticulable or inchoate or whatever, that can be one way of preserving. But I think the practice-based commitments might be somewhat analogous in the sense that I mean, I think it's going to depend on what exactly the practices are. But at least if you interpret it in a certain way, it might look like so long as the practices aren't involving the imposing of great costs on yourself, and so long as they don't invite you to sort of think of them as requiring you to sacrifice other goods that are also valued, then they won't be destabilized, or at least won't be as likely to be destabilized by that kind of reflection. It might though depend on like which particular, so imagine that the practices within a certain religion, for example, require, well, imagine we're thinking of something like like early ascetic Christianity or something like that, right? Where some of the practices there would involve things like renunciation of very strong natural desires and things like that. I think that sort of thing is going to be harder to remain wholeheartedly committed to if you have this sort of philosophical picture in mind, because presumably at each moment you could raise the question, as I fast for the fourth day, or as I with myself, or whatever, as I inflict these sufferings on myself, I can ask why am I prioritizing this sort of life over these other equally reasonable sorts of life? And then it's going to, not for everyone, but for some people it might attenuate. So I think it's going to depend on the content of the if that makes sense. Yeah, it's a really interesting question.
For you, it might have been as much political protest.
Sorry.
I think for the monks who did that, the estate.
Oh,
it might have been as much political protest.
Yeah, so if there are other things like that in the background, it might be easier. Yeah, so if you're thinking that I'm doing this not just because some ethereal idealism, but there's this really concrete thing that I will achieve and willing to undergo sacrifice for it, that's probably a little easier. Yeah. Some really interesting questions.
So you've talked a little bit about what your worries are about the steadfast sort of dogmatist side of things, right?
Yeah.
And then how pluralism challenges that. But why? I don't quite understand what worries about relativism.
Oh, okay.
In the sense that, like, why can't that be a commitment?
Yeah.
To just describe all difference and accept that difference is all there is. In that we won't find common ground.
Yeah.
Like, why is that can't be a discovery of pluralism? What's wrong with that? What's the
I mean, it could. So I guess the thing that worries me about it is the point about sort of self-sacrifice and difficulty and challenge that I was mentioning earlier.
Yeah.
So it's so I think it makes sense to have, well, let me put it this way. So like commitments come in different degrees of strength, right? Like sometimes we say somebody is committed to something, but that just means they'll undergo like a little bit of difficulty for it, but they won't make great sacrifices. So like I might be committed to having a cup of coffee in the morning, and that means I'll go to the cafe and stuff, but I'm not going to like inflict severe suffering on myself to get a coffee. I'm not committed to it in that way. Or I'm committed to teaching my classes at the scheduled time. But if there's some work, like if my daughter is very sick or something, I'll cancel the class. I need to take care of her, right? So there's a commitment, but it's like certain things will undermine the commitment. Other commitments are stronger. So, I have like the parent-child commitment that I just mentioned, that tends to be pretty strong, where like people will usually undergo quite a lot of difficulty and struggle and so forth in order to preserve that commitment. So when we get into the realm of these like really strong, resolute commitments, I guess I'm worried that these sort of philosophical reflections on pluralism and so forth risk turning those strong commitments into the more ordinary forms of commitment. So I don't doubt that somebody could be committed to relativism in the way that I'm committed to going on vacation or drinking coffee or things like this. I guess I worry more about whether they could remain committed to it in a much more resolute, steadfast way. In part, this is like, I guess I'm sort of influenced by Nietzsche here. So Nietzsche, I guess some of you guys are reading, he has this, so he distinguishes a lot of forms of what he calls nihilism. He has like at least 5 or 6 different forms of nihilism. But one of them is basically this thing I've been describing, this loss of the ability to sustain strong commitments. He has these characters that he calls the last men, who are basically good people who sustain strong commitments. There's other features too, but that's one of the big ones. And I guess I'm sort of influenced. I mean, so Nietzsche thinks that's like an impending crisis or something that we're going to face in modernity. And he tries to find a way out of it. I guess I'm I'm sort of convinced by that, and that not that it's unavoidable, but that it is a real problem in modernity. Like I think you definitely see strong commitments. Like, obviously, there are lots of people who are like strongly committed to political views or to social positions or whatever. So there's no lack of strong commitments in the contemporary world, right? But I do think that there is this phenomenon where the people who are the most critically reflective about commitments tend not to be the ones with those exceptionally strong forms of commitment. So I think there is this phenomenon where there's like a dissociation between degree of strong commitment and degree of critical reflection. And I think it's like a sort of distinctively modern problem for the reason I mentioned in response to your question about how if you weren't a pluralist, if you were convinced that either now or in the future we'll have this sort of unitary theory that will be the single correct theory, then these problems are either resolvable right now or in the future they will be. But if you really think we're going to be stuck with pluralism, then I think you get into this worry about whether you have to pick and choose between strong commitments and critical reflection, whether those are sort of opposed to one another, so that you either have one or the other, but not both. And what I'm interested in is whether you have both. So, yeah.
All right, well, thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Tomorrow at 11 o'clock here in the seminar room, Paul will be Q&A, just to talk about your research. So please come for that. There'll be snacks, there'll be a brunch served. And tomorrow night, Paul's going to be giving a talk on fanaticism.
Yeah.
Is that also in your book, or is it?
It is, yeah.
Yeah, so he'll be talking about fanaticism. That'll be in the Shell Theater, which is over in Miller Creative Quad, the film stream. So if you have it there, it's going to be awesome. Great talk. 7 o'clock. Is that right? 7 o'clock.
I think that's right. Yeah.
And there's another. Oh, we'll be giving out some books, and Paul will be signing books. This is our book for next semester. We'll be doing it. So look forward to seeing everybody tomorrow. And thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks for coming. I really enjoyed that. So it's great talking about. That's right.